Hello and welcome to Nana's Crafty Home. My name is Tanya. Today's tutorial is going to show you how to crochet the rectangle granny. This is a beginner friendly and fun stitch. We are just creating a rectangle shape using the traditional granny stitch. So your granny rectangle can be adjusted for size. You would just need to adjust your foundation chain in multiples of 3 plus 2. I have my yarn on my hook here. I'm going to work my sample in a total of 18 chains plus 2 for a total of 20. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. I'm going to work one single crochet in the third chain from the hook. So counting over, that's 1, 2, and 3. Work a single crochet in that third chain. Now you could go ahead and mark that space. So I've skipped extra chains at the beginning, more than I normally would, because I'm going to be working in that space later. So if you wanted to, you could go ahead and mark those skipped chains so that way it'll be easily found when we come back to it. So I'm going to put a stitch marker in there, and now I'm going to work a single crochet in every chain to the end. So single crochet in each chain all the way to my end here. So I've worked a single crochet in every chain to the end. I'm going to go ahead and turn and then chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to work 2 double crochets in the same stitch at the base of my beginning chain. I'm going to work 2 double crochets. This is called a beginning cluster, and a beginning cluster is always going to be a chain 3, which is going to count as a stitch with 2 double crochets all worked in the same stitch or space. And a cluster, as I'm going to be working next, is 3 double crochets all worked in the same stitch or the same space. So I'm going to skip the next 2 stitches and I'm going to work a cluster, 3 double crochet stitches all worked in that next stitch. So 3 double crochets, 1, 2, and 3, all worked in that same stitch. Skip 2, work a cluster in the next. 3 double crochets in that next stitch. And we're going to continue that on down. Skipping 2, 3 double crochets in the next to create a cluster. Skip 2, 3 double crochets in the next. Skip 2, 3 double crochets in the next stitch for a cluster. And now you can see my stitch marker. I have 2 stitches here that I'm going to skip, and in that space that I've marked, those skipped chains from the very beginning, I'm going to work a corner. And in that corner, I'm going to work a cluster, so 3 double crochets, chain 2, and then another cluster all worked in that same space. And so you can see by marking those skip chains, it made it a lot easier to work into that space. Chain 2, cluster in that same space. So this allowed me to turn so that now I'm going to be working in the unused loops from my foundation chain. So in that same space where I had my stitch marker, those skip chains from the beginning, I worked a cluster, chain 2, cluster, chain 2, cluster, all in that same space. Now I'm just going to repeat that same stitch pattern, skipping the next 2 loops. So you may have to pull this back a little bit so that you can see your unused loops down here. But you can see here, here's a loop and there's one, and I'm going to work a cluster in that next loop. So 3 double crochets all worked in that same stitch. And so to make sure that you're in the same stitch, just kind of look to make sure that that cluster is directly opposite of the cluster on the other side. So then skip the next 2 stitches, cluster in the next. Skip the next 2, cluster in the next. Skip the next 2, cluster in the next. Skip the next 2, cluster in the next. So I'm at the end here. You can see I have 2, I'm at the last 3 stitches. There's 3 loops left. So I'm going to skip the next 2, and in that last loop, I'm going to work a cluster, chain 2, and a cluster. And then a chain 2, and now I'm going to work a slip stitch into the top of that chain 3 from the beginning. So in the top of my chain 3, just work a slip stitch. So we're ready to move on to round 3, and I'm going to change colors for this round. So I'm going to go ahead and fasten off this light gray or silver color that I have and bring in this fun peach color. This is a great project for your scrap yarn. So I'm going to join, for this round, I'm going to join my next color in that last chain 2 space from my previous round, and I'm going to work a beginning cluster. And a beginning cluster again is that chain 3, which counts as my first stitch of a cluster, and then work 2 double crochets all in that same space, chain 2, and then work another cluster in that same chain 2 space. And so that's my new corner for this round, that chain 2. I'm going to skip over the next 3 double crochet cluster, and I'm going to work another cluster in that space between these 2 clusters. So yarning over and inserting my hook in that space between, work 3 double crochets. And I'm just going to be repeating that all the way down to my next chain 2 corner space. So work a cluster in between each cluster from the previous round. So 3 double crochets in that space, 3 double crochets in the next space, so I get to my chain 2 corner space and I'm going to work a corner. So cluster in that chain 2 space, 3 double crochets, chain 2, and 3 double crochets, all worked in that same chain 2 space. Skip over that cluster from the previous round, and in that next chain 2 corner space, work another corner. Cluster, 3 double crochets, chain 2, and 3 double crochets, a cluster in that same chain 2 corner space. So then I'm going to repeat working a cluster, 3 double crochets in each space between clusters from that previous round. So then when I get to my last chain 2 space, I'm going to work a cluster, chain 2, and a cluster, all worked in that same chain 2 space. So double crochet, 3 double crochets, chain 2, and 3 double crochets, all worked in that same space. And then I'm going to skip over that last cluster and work a slip stitch into the top of that chain 3 from the beginning. And I'm ready for the next round, and I'm going to join in a new color. So I'm going to fasten off that color. We're going to take a look at this. Already starting to see that rectangle shape. And I'm going to bring in a nice dark gray for round 4. So for this round, you can attach to any chain 2 corner space from the previous round. So beginning cluster, 1, 2, 3, 2 double crochets, all worked in that same chain 2 space. Chain 2 and another cluster, 3 double crochets, all worked in that same space, and repeating 3 double crochet cluster between each of these clusters from the previous round. And I'm going to repeat that all the way down to my next chain 2 corner space and repeat my corner. So when I get to my next chain 2 corner space, in that space I'm going to work another corner, which is a cluster, 3 double crochet stitches, chain 2, and 3 double crochets, all worked in that same chain 2 space. So then I'm going to be working a cluster between these next 2 clusters from the previous round. 3 3 double crochets, and then I have another chain 2 corner space. I'm going to work another corner, cluster, chain 2, cluster, all worked in that chain 2 space. And now I'm going to repeat a cluster of 3 double crochets between each cluster from the previous round. So between these clusters, work another set of 3 double crochets. And just continue repeating that down to the next chain 2 corner space. I'm in the next chain 2 corner space, work another corner, cluster, chain 2, cluster, all worked in that same space. So really it's as simple as that. You're working a cluster between clusters from the previous round, and in chain 2 spaces you're working a corner of cluster, chain 2, cluster, all worked in that same space. And then when you get back to the beginning, you're going to slip stitch into the top of the chain 3 from your beginning cluster. So I've repeated that round, and you're just going to be repeating those same steps for however many rounds you want to do to the size desired. So you can see that I have worked several rounds, and this is really coming together nicely. I wanted to show you, if you didn't want to change colors between rounds, or you wanted to work additional rounds before you changed colors, how you would do that. So I have worked this round. I'm back to the beginning. I am going to go ahead and finish my round just as I normally would, with a slip stitch into the top of that chain 3 from the beginning cluster. And now I'm going to go ahead and slip stitch into the top of that next double crochet, slip stitch into the top of the next double crochet. This is my chain 2 corner space. I'm going to slip stitch into that corner space, and now I'm going to do my beginning cluster by chaining 3 and then 2 double crochets into that chain 2 corner space, and then work my round just as I normally would. So that way you don't have to fasten off between every round. It's an easy way to get into your chain 2 corner space and start a round. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss a new video. Thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.